Okay, we are ready. So if you've got your own translation, we're in 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 8. And again, if you see something in your translation that is different from what we're following, and I've put on the screen today the ESV translation. We're starting in verse 8. One day, Elisha went on to Shunem. This is in the tribal territory of Issachar, of the 12 tribes territories, where a wealthy woman, and the word that's used there literally in Hebrew means large woman, big woman. So it may refer to her size, but more than likely, most commentators and translators take this to refer to her status, that she was a very wealthy, prominent, influential woman. She lived there, and she urged him to eat some food every time he came through. Apparently, he had a circuit, much like Elijah had a circuit, Elisha had a circuit. And as he came to her town in Shunem and did his work there and prophesied and taught, she would urge him to have food. She was just really hospitable. So whenever he passed that way, he would turn in there to eat. Now here's a picture of the area that we're talking about. And Shunem is right here. Can you see Shunem in the middle of the map? And where Elijah raised the widow's son, it was in Zarephath, up here outside of Israel, in the Phoenician territory. But now Elisha is still in Israel. He's in Galilee, and he that's where his activity is going to be. And he will go to Carmel, and that's where she will go rushing to him when her son dies. And then they will come back together to Shunem. And then after that, he's got a number of other things that he does in the intervening chapters after chapter 4. And then we're going to skip to chapter 8, where the Shunammite widow comes back, woman comes back into the picture. And so it's the rest of the story. So any questions about the locations of these places? Remember that when Saul took on the Philistines and was killed in battle, the Philistine army was in Shunem on the southern side of the hill of Moreh, across the Jezreel Valley, which runs between Shunem and Jezreel, and the Israeli army was in Jezreel, so they're right across from each other. And that's when he goes to see the witch of Endor, which was living behind the hill of Moreh in Endor. So any questions about the geography? I think that's kind of worthwhile to kind of keep in your mind as a picture. Now, there's something else that I like to do when going through the Bible. I'd like you to think that you're a movie producer and that you're going to make a movie of this episode. Because what that disciplines us to do is to ask ourselves, well, how do we picture these people? If I was making a movie, how old would these people be? What actors would I select to picture them? And what tone of voice would they use for some of the things that they say to one another? And you've got quite a range of choices available when you are taking the words that are in a text and trying to now produce it out loud. So in the back of your mind, kind of keep that, because every once in a while, I'm going to ask you, if you were the movie producer, how would you picture this person? How old would the boy be? How old is the woman? How old is her older husband? And so forth. We're now in verse 9. So she says to her husband, unlike the woman that Elijah went to see in Zarephath, she's not a widow. Behold now, I know that this is a holy man of God. So somehow she came to the conclusion by listening to him, by hearing him, that he really represented the God of Israel. So we don't know if that means she's a Jew or if that means that she might be simply an outsider who has come to know the God of Israel through Elisha. We just don't know for sure. The text doesn't tell us. He's continually passing our way. Let us make a small room on the roof with walls and put there for him 4 pieces of furniture, a bed, a table, a chair, and a lamp, so that whenever he comes to us, he can go in there. So up to this time, we don't know where Elisha would stay. When he passed through, maybe he just went to a cave and kind of curled up. Maybe he had some other people who were hospitable to him, but you remember that hospitality is one of the prime requirements in the ancient society, and especially among the Jews to fellow Jews, that if a stranger Jew came into town, you just took care of it. You didn't make him go to Motel 6. All right. So here's a picture of what some people pictured Capernaum to look like, with its flat roofed houses. And if this is kind of gives you an idea of what they might have been doing, usually a lot of the houses that we found archaeologically, for example, in Capernaum, have a staircase running up the side of the wall to what we think was the upper level. The upper level is no longer there. Now we have the lower level and the staircase next to it. But that's why this particular artist pictured it this way in this drawing. And they could simply put a lean-to up on top of the roof because it would get so hot and muggy up in Galilee. It was hotter and muggier in Galilee than it was in Jerusalem during the summer. And many people from Galilee today will come down to Jerusalem in the summertime to vacation, because every evening the breezes come in from the Mediterranean and it cools down to about 55 degrees, even though it's about 90 degrees during the daytime. And so it's just very refreshing. So they may have put a kind of a second story up here and put a building on top. Now you'll notice here in this artist's rendering, they've got fish that are drying on the roof. They use their roofs, their flat roofs, for a number of different purposes, either to go up and rest. They would create maybe a lean-to to give them shade and to get out of the houses. That look at how few windows these houses have. And that's what's been found archaeologically. Why would you have few windows? Well, they didn't have screens in those days. And it keeps the bugs out, and it keeps the rodents out, and the vermin. And so you would not have a whole lot of big picture windows in your house. And if these houses are crammed together like this, you can imagine how little circulation there would be of air in some of these homes. And so they would have to retreat to the roof in order to find some relief. So one day he came there, this is Elisha, and he turned into the chamber and rested there. So he took advantage of her hospitality and her husband's. And he said to Gehazi, his servant, first time we hear about this servant of Elisha, call this Shunammite woman. And when he had called her, she stood before him. Now, who's the him? And that's the thing about Hebrew, is that when it uses a pronoun, you aren't always sure where the antecedent is. Is she standing before Elisha, or is she standing before Gehazi, his servant? And there are different guesses by commentators, and I'll give you a guess in just a second. And he said to him, he didn't say to her. So it sounds like Elisha is asking Gehazi to be the go-between between the woman and him. And we'll talk about why would he do that. Say now to her. So here we're told specifically in the text that he's expecting Gehazi to be his spokesman. See, you have taken all this trouble for us. What is it to be done for you? What is there to be done for you? Would you have a word spoken on your behalf to the king or to the commander of the army? Now that's an interesting offer. Elijah, we know, was hated by the king and by the military commanders because he railed down all kinds of condemnation on them. Elisha seems to have access to the monarch and to some of the people who are in power. And we're going to see at the next segment of the story in chapter 8 that he definitely has some influence among the monarch, because he's going to go to bat for the lady by sending Gehazi to the monarch to talk to him. Yeah. So this is a little difference between the ministry of Elijah, who constantly seemed to be in conflict with the king of Israel, and Elisha, who somehow, even though he's still being truthful to the word of God, even though he's doing all these miracles, even though he's representing the word of God and God's disfavor with their Baal worship and so on, somehow his personality or his approach left him open a channel with the monarch. And I can't explain it beyond that. That's the best that I can envision it, okay? So my question to you is this. If you were Elisha, why would you send your servant to talk to this woman, to say to her, you know, you've been so nice to us. What favor can we do for you? Why wouldn't he just say that to her directly? Anybody have a guess? I'll tell you what a few other people have guessed, but first I want to see if you have any. Why would you do that? Well, one guess from one commentator was that she might feel so self-conscious that she wouldn't want to ask a favor of this man who is a man of God and has all that status, God-given status. And so it would be easier for her to say, oh, well, I guess I could use this to a representative that was not Elisha himself. And that has some plausibility in my mind, okay? Now, maybe that kicks loose a different thought in your mind. I did hear one that I thought was really degrading. It says, a prophet would never talk to a woman. Excuse me, we got too many stories of Elijah talking to a woman, okay? And we know that women were not treated as equally in the ancient cultures as they are now, but there's no indication that the prophets simply discriminated against women and wouldn't talk to them and considered it below their dignity. I think that's not a good guess, okay, if you're going to try to explain why he sends a spokesman. And then the question is, does he keep doing that? Or will later in the story, he talk directly to the woman? So watch for that, see if there's the switch. Any other thoughts, please? Yeah. That's a good question. He's been eating from her. You would think he's been talking to her saying, Toda, thank you for the food. So we assume there's been some communication. So why would he go through an intermediary? It's a mystery in the text, quite frankly. Commentators just can't, from the text, find any evidence to explain for sure why their guess is right. Okay, so we're guessing, and that's okay to identify that. And as long as we admit we're guessing. But if you get someone who's too sure about certain things where the text isn't clear, be a little suspicious, okay? They're putting their meaning on top of the text rather than extracting an understanding of the text. And that's one reason for asking these questions. Somebody else had a hand up, please, Vince. Ah, is that the ESV study Bible? That's the Lutheran Study Bible? Yeah, now that's a good thought. I'd seen that, but I forgot it. It's possible that she had a different dialect and a different language. And so Gehazi was better equipped to communicate with her. The problem we're going to have with that guess is later on, okay? See if he ever does talk directly to her, because if he does, maybe by that time he's become comfortable enough to struggle with her dialect and so forth. Any other thoughts before we move on? But it's kind of fun, isn't it, to see that he is trying to reciprocate. And when I was on my sabbatical in Jerusalem for 3 months, I got to know this Palestinian who owned a gift store in Bethlehem, and he invited me over to his home for supper. And so I brought a gift, some flowers for his wife and so on, because I understood that was part of the cultural requirement. And we had a very fine meal. And so the next time we went out together, we had to have lunch. And he said, let's stop here for lunch. And I said, yeah, but why don't you let me pay this time? He said, no, absolutely not. When we offer you hospitality in Palestine, we offer it to you from A to Z. And so he said, we would be offended if you tried to pay for us, because that is not accepting our hospitality. Plus, I learned after I got back from my Hebrew professor, who was informing us of the Palestinian culture and Israeli culture, if you give somebody a gift, what are you obligating them to do? Reciprocate, not just say thank you, reciprocate with a greater gift. And so, and this instructor told us about how he went to the home of a Palestinian, and he knocked on the door and he brought this gift. And the door opened and the husband answered the door and he said, hi, here. And the guy slammed the door in his face. And there was all kinds of yelling and screaming going on inside the house for about 5 minutes as he stood outside the door. And finally, they opened the door because they found a gift that they could reciprocate with. But until that time, they were vulnerable, okay? And so it's just a different cultural understanding of what's required. Now, we have our rules, too, about hospitality. I mean, what German or Scandinavian host is going to have someone come into their house and not offer them something to eat, right? I mean, that's one of the features of hospitality in our culture. Hey, would you like a cup of coffee? Would you like a donut? You know, and I'll never forget visiting this one lady when I was making home visits. She was an older widow, and she had just made a bundt cake, and she offered me it. And that was the morning I had started on a diet. And so I said, no, thank you. She was crestfallen. And I thought, Stadler, that was dumb. Forget your doggone diet, okay? So I said, please, I'd love to have a piece of cake. But even in our culture, there are certain unspoken rules, aren't there, about hospitality and what you're expected to do and what you're not expected to do and so forth. Let's go on. In verse 14, he said, this is now, she apparently has been dismissed because she said, I dwell among my own people. That's all she says. And we're supposed to understand what she's saying with that. And I think what she's saying is, I'm taken care of. I'm in my own culture. And maybe that's why the footnote in the Lutheran Study Bible suggests there may have been a difference between her and Elijah in terms of dialect and so on, that she comes from a different group of residents who, and their loyalty to each other took care of each other. And so she may be saying to him, look, I really don't need any special help. I don't need a special appeal to the king or to the commanders. I'm being taken care of. And for my safety, my people are taken. We've got each other's backs, okay? That may be what she's saying here. And she was wealthy, that's right. So, and that's an important, if the word Gedalah means wealthy, that she's a big woman, then she doesn't really need a whole lot. She's got servants, she's got means, okay, assets. And so in verse 14, Elisha is frustrated, and he says to Gehazi, what then is to be done for her? Help me out here. Help me guess what we can do to show our thankfulness for her hospitality. And Gehazi answered, well, she has no son. And that it kind of implies, you know, in our culture, women want to have children. And a woman who doesn't have a child is sometimes discriminated against. You know, look at the way Rachel was treated by Leah. And look at the way Sarah was treated by Hagar. Because they didn't have any children, but the other woman did. You know, I'm fertile. You know, look at me. I'm a blessing to the man, and you aren't giving him anything, you know. And so Gehazi may have thought, if we can give her a son somehow, he must have assumed that Elisha had that connection with God to be able to make that happen. That would be a great gift for her. And on top of that, her husband is old. Was Sarah's husband old when she had her miracle son? Oh, yeah, yeah. And so often in the text of Hebrew, the implication seems to be it's not her fault that she's not capable. It's the old guy who's too old now, and he can't produce what she needs, okay? So there, it may be, and watch for this, the soap opera between her and her husband, because there's something going on below the surface that we can talk about. So anyway, he says to her, he said, call her. So bring her back. Now, is he going to talk to her directly, or is he going to talk through Gehazi? And when he had called her, she stood in the doorway. The word literally means opening. So she stood in the doorway. Who else was in the doorway when she heard that she was going to have a miracle child? Sarah was in the doorway of the tent, and she was hearing this conversation between Abram and the Lord. And she stood in the doorway in verse 16. He said, at this season, about this time next year, you shall embrace a son. Sounds to me like he's talking to her directly now. Now, let's keep checking. And she said, no, my Lord, O man of God. So now she's talking directly to him, not to Gehazi. Do not lie to your servant, Don't set me up for a heartbreak of heartbreaks and tell me I'm going to have a child when I'm this old and my husband is that old, and then we don't have it, okay? I'd rather have no hope at all than to have a hope that is shattered. The woman conceived, though, and she bore a son. And about that time, the following spring, as Elisha had said to her. So it happened. And that's, we're told in very economical language. And when the child had grown, so now we kind of got to skip forward. If you're the movie director, how many years are you going to skip ahead? And what age is the boy going to be when he's out here in the field with his dad and he has a headache that kills him? Okay. You say 12. Anybody else have a different guess? Because you can't be wrong because the text doesn't tell us. How do you picture him if you're the movie director? What age child are you going to get here for the movie? 15. Okay. Now, let's look at the text to see if there's some hints in the text that might revise our guess, okay? I learned this from Ken 2 weeks ago when I assumed that the child was a teenager, and he pointed out that the woman carried the child, which kind of argues against a big guy, okay? So when the child had grown, he went out one day to his father among the reapers. So this would be in the summer when it's hot and it's muggy up in Galilee. And he said to his father, "Oh, my head, my head." The father said to his servant, "Carry him to his mother." So is he having a cerebral aneurysm? What else could create a fierce headache? Sunstroke is what a lot of commentators say. Yeah, he's been exposed to the sun and it's having an effect on him. There's a third possibility, and I didn't think about it until last night. Dehydration. I was a victim of dehydration when I was on my sabbatical, and we were hiking through the hills of Qumran, going into some of the caves where they found scrolls. And I finally had to say to the director of our class, "I'm going back to the bus. I got to get air conditioning. I'm really in bad shape." And so I got into the bus and I poured water all over my head. That night, I'm cramped up in my bed with my knees in my chest because I had a most ferocious headache. And that's what dehydration does. And when I was on an archaeological dig in 1982, we had to get up at 4:30, work until noon, and then quit because we beat the heat that way. And we had a camp nurse. And I went to the camp nurse one morning and said, "I got this headache. Have you got any aspirin?" She says, "No, you're just not drinking enough water." I said, "What do you mean? I drank a whole quart." She said, "No, you got to be drinking a gallon." She said, "If you're not going to the bathroom, you're not drinking enough water. Because when you're drinking enough water to hydrate your system, it'll come out of your body. But if it's not coming out of your body, you don't have enough in it, okay?" And sure enough, I drank half a gallon between then and when we quit, and the headache went away. So maybe he was suffering heat stroke. Maybe he was suffering an aneurysm. Maybe he said, we just aren't told. But he is carried to his mother, verse 20. He had lifted him and brought him to his mother. The child sat on her lap till noon, and then he died. Pardon me? He can't be 15 if he's sitting on her lap till noon, okay? So maybe we're gonna have to revise our candidates for this role. And she went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God and shut the door behind him and went out. So she carries him herself, not her husband, not their servants. She carries him upstairs and lays him on the bed. So again, that may revise how we cast this. Maybe 6, 7, maybe 8, I don't know. Our 10-year-old grandson is pretty light. I could carry him even at this age. And so we don't know, but at any rate, he has died. Then she called, and the text is very explicit here. It's not like he was unconscious and was waiting to be revived. He's dead. Then she called to her husband, and she does not say, "Our son has died." That's completely missing from the text. And said, "Send me one of the servants and one of the donkeys, that I may quickly go to the man of God and come back again." So she's going to go chase down Elisha, who is passed through their area and is somewhere else on Mount Carmel. And he said, "Why? Will you go to him today? It's not a new moon nor a Sabbath. That's the usual time when a prophet gathers people together on those special feast days. Oh, so what's the big deal? And apparently she still doesn't tell him. Now, are you getting some hints about the nature of their relationship, their marriage? Okay. Now, maybe I'm reading way too much into this. And if I am, I'm sorry. But I think there's some hints here that they do not have the best marriage relationship going. And she said, shalom. That's all that's in the Hebrew text. Shalom. Everything is at peace. Everything is well. The word shalom means completely full, satisfied. Okay. So it's more than just absence of stress and absence of conflict. It means completeness. So she, in a sense, lies to her husband, doesn't she? I mean, I can't imagine one of our children dying and my wife not telling me immediately, and keeping it from me and saying, I got to go see a doctor. Get me a cab, get me a Uber driver. Okay. And so then verse 24, she saddled the donkey and she said to her servant, urge the animal on. Do not slacken the pace for me unless I tell you. So she set out and came to the man of God at Mount Carmel. Now that's about, some estimate, 18 and a half miles. Okay. So here's Shunem on the map and here's Mount Carmel. Now, Mount Carmel is actually a range. It's a range that runs like, it's a range that runs like this along the river Kishon, okay? And so it could be anywhere in that range that she figures out where he's at. And maybe because of their constant meals together and their conversations, she knew what his route was. So she's going to chase after him. And she says to her servant, don't slow down on my account. I know I'm the lady of the house. I'm the mistress of the manor. But you just push us. We got to get there as fast as we can. And I'll let you know if we're going too fast. Okay, that's a good question. That's a very good question. You got a donkey, you're driving the donkey, 18 and a half miles. You know what the distance is from here to Hastings? 17 and a half miles from Woodbury to Hastings. If you had to walk from here to Hastings, how long would it take you? I think it'd take at least 12 hours. That's what I'm guessing. Even though she's in a dead run to get to where he is, you're looking at the best part of a day at best, maybe a day and a half. Those are just guesses. And then you got to come back, okay? So it kind of reminds me of when Jesus received news that Lazarus was sick. He waits an extra 2 days before he comes. And then he heads back. So it took the messengers 1 day to get to him on the other side of the Jordan River. And then it takes him another day to get back. And by the time he gets there, Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. So here's a map of Woodbury to Hastings. So without all the expressways and all that stuff, you'd have to hoof it overland with your donkey. And donkeys are a blessing because we've taken donkeys through the hills of Israel. And I'm so glad that I didn't have to walk up some of those hills because they are very sure-footed. And so if they got to go up and down through this Kishon River Valley, that would be a blessing and a half. No, that's right. And so you're still looking at maybe a brisk walking tempo and to go 18 miles approximately. Now, I may be wrong. Maybe it was only to where he was on Mount Carmel, 16 miles, 15 miles, even still, that's going to be the best part of a day. And if it's a summer when her son was stricken with either sunstroke or dehydration or so on, that's got to affect her too. Okay, and so they go looking for Elisha. When the man of God saw her coming, he said to Gehazi, his servant, look, there's the Shunammite. Run at once to meet her and say to her, is all well with you? The word is shalom. Is all well with your husband? Shalom. Is all well with your child? Shalom. And she answered to Gehazi, shalom. It wasn't, okay? But she's not going to say that to Gehazi, the in-between, the go-between. She's going to say it directly to the man who she wants to help her son. And when she came to the mountain, to the man of God, she caught hold of his feet. Now, I don't know if that's a cultural thing, but can you think of any other times when women grab the feet of prophets or teachers or rabbis? On Easter, the women see Jesus and they grab his feet, and he says to Mary Magdalene, "Don't keep grabbing onto me. I got to go to the Father." So that is so different from what we experienced in India, because in India, feet are considered untouchable. And that's why when the Indians wear sandals, they kick them off before they come into their holy place, into their church, and they go in barefoot. So we had to learn to do that, either kick off our shoes or just wear our socks in, okay, if we weren't wearing sandals. But I found out in a hurry that I didn't have the best sandals, because all their sandals just have nothing on the back, so they just kick them off real easily. I don't feel comfortable walking in sandals that way. I like to have something around the back of my heel. So I reached down and I pull it off. Not good. Not good. You don't touch your feet, okay? And when we would preach for their big festival services, we'd sit on a dais above the ground about 4 feet, and they said, "Don't cross your legs. Whatever you do, don't cross your legs. We know you Americans all cross your legs, okay? But don't cross your legs." Why? Because the bottom of the foot is considered the biggest insult. If you show the bottom of your foot to these people, you are insulting them. So and boy, did I have to discipline myself. I hold on to my leg, keep that thing down, okay? Because we just have that built into us, kind of. So apparently that did not keep her from, that was not the cultural taboo here, as it is in India. And so when she grabs a hold of him, Gehazi came to push her away. Does that sound like anybody else? When someone came to a rabbi in order to have a blessing? When the children were brought by, and the disciples said, "Get them away, don't bother the Jesus with this." And that may have been Gehazi's motive too. Don't bother the prophet. But the man of God said, "Leave her alone, for she is in bitter distress. And the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me." So apparently there were times when God gave him prophetic insight, and there are other times when God said, "No, Elisha, you're going to have to figure this one out on your own. You're going to have to talk to people. You have to gather information." And that gives us an insight into prophetic knowledge, that sometimes they had it and sometimes they didn't. And it was entirely up to the sovereignty of God when he gives his prophets that kind of insight. Then she said, "Did I ask my Lord for a son?" Huh? It's a rhetorical question, obviously. Did I not say, "Do not deceive me"? Don't give me something and then take it away and allow it to be taken. I'd rather have no son at all and be barren for the rest of my life than to have to go through this death, okay? She's in extreme grief, and so we can understand, what she's saying here, can't we? And the pain that she's experiencing. Then Elisha says to Gehazi, "Tie up your garment." Literally, gird up your loins. Now, to gird up your loins, what you did was you reached between your legs and you grabbed your robe and you hoisted it up here, and then you tucked it in your belt that you had around your waist so that you could run. Because if you left it down, you'd trip all over it, okay? I tripped over my own preaching robe many a time in the church, going up from one step to the other, and because I wasn't careful. So this would reduce that, because what he's saying to Gehazi is, I want you to get there as fast as you can. If you meet anyone, do not greet him. And if anyone greets you, do not reply. And if you know anything about Middle Eastern conversation, it's not just, "Hi there, how you doing?" and off you go. There's a lot of exchange going on. And he's saying, no, not in this case. In this case, you make a beeline for Shunem. And then take my staff and lay my staff on the face of the child. Kind of interesting. In Psalm 23, it says, "Your rod and your staff, they comfort me." And rod, the words that's used there, shiftika, is a short handled weapon with a metal end that you use to club predator animals. The staff is what he uses to guide the sheep. And so that's the word that's used here, is mishantheka. And so he takes that and he gives it to Gehazi, says, lay this on the face of the child. Does he expect that to do a miracle? I don't know. Some commentators say, yeah. And he just didn't know what he was doing. The Jewish commentators usually say that. And he has to learn. Others have said, no, he's using this as a pedagogical tool to teach his understudy, Gehazi, you can't do magic just with a thing. You need my prophetic presence. So he's going to go there and he's going to fail with the staff. And sure enough, that's what happens. Now, maybe that was for pedagogical reason, and maybe Elisha knew, but he does tell us earlier, remember, the Lord hasn't told me everything I need to know. And he may not at this stage have also informed Elisha, here's how I'm going to bring this child back to life, or whether he wants to bring the child back to life. But he's going to go there himself. Then the mother of the child said, I'm not going to go follow Gehazi. I will not leave you. As the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you. Does that remind you of some words we've already heard in the story of Elijah and Elisha? In 2 Kings chapter 2, in verse 2, 4, and 6, you have exactly the same words used by Elisha. When Elijah tells him, I got to go to the next stop, you stay here. And he says the exact same thing. Now, even if you don't know Hebrew, I put this up on the screen. It's absolutely identical. You can see that they're exactly, go up and down, up and down. They're all exactly the same words that are used in both. Now, you see that similarity? Yeah. So either this was a oath form that was common, or somehow she knew the story of Elijah and Elisha. And she's banking that this will tell him, I want to stick to you like glue. I want you to go with me. I want you in my son's death chamber or in your room. I don't just want your understudy. So he arose and followed her. He followed her. So does that mean she's outrunning him? Is she younger than he? And is she in such a urgent need that she's going to just, against all odds, hustle back? Gehazi went ahead of them and laid the staff on the face of the child, but there was no sound or sign of life. Therefore, he returned to meet Elisha and told him the child has not awakened. In other words, he hasn't come back to life. This didn't work. How far did he have to come back? I don't know. But let's say it's 18 miles. And let's say he takes off on a dead run. Maybe he's going twice as fast as the woman can lead Elisha. So he gets there in 4 or 5 hours, fails, grabs the staff, and heads back. They might be, I don't know, you can do the math on that and figure out where he finds it. But he does give him the information while he's in transit on the way to Shunem. Verse 32, when Elisha came into the house, he saw the child lying dead on his bed. Now there's another textual evidence that the child wasn't just sleeping or unconscious, he's dead. And so he went in, verse 33, shut the door behind the two of them. Now, which two is that? Is that Gehazi and Elisha? Or is it Elisha and the mom? When Jesus heals Jairus' daughter and raises her from the dead, who does he take into the room with him? Do you remember the story? Who goes in? Peter, James, John, Jairus, and the mother. Here, Elisha does not do that, because the next words are going to tell us that she's outside waiting. So it must have been Gehazi that he's suggesting is here. And he prayed to the Lord. So the first thing he does is pray and ask, maybe, I don't know what he was in the prayer, but he may have asked, Lord, do you want this boy to come back to life? If so, will you do it here? what do you want me to do? And give me some kind of an indication of what I'm supposed to do. So maybe all of the things that he follows here, all the behaviors are dictated by God, but we don't know that empirically. But it's maybe a safe guess since he's a man of God and he speaks for God. And so why does he shut the door? Is that for the same reason that Jesus shut the door and didn't let all the people downstairs in Jairus's house see what he did, so that they wouldn't learn some superstitious rituals and see, oh, that's what we have to do. We can raise the dead if we just do what he did. That may be why he did it. I'm just guessing. I don't have an answer. Maybe you got a better guess than I do. But that would be my first guess. And I'll keep evaluating it. And he went up and lay on the child, putting his mouth on his mouth, his eyes on his eyes, and his hands on his hands. And as he stretched himself upon him, the boy, the flesh of the child became warm. Now, some have suggested that God is progressively bringing life back into the child. And this is the first indication that some life is coming because the body's getting warm. Others have suggested, no, this is simply an indication that the body warmth of Elisha is communicated to the flesh of this boy, because he gets up and walks back and forth in the house, not just in his room. So he must have gone up and down the stairs, and I don't know what he's doing. Is he praying? Is he questioning himself? What should I do? And he went back up and he stretched himself upon him again. The child this time sneezed 7 times, and the child opened his eyes, and life had come back into him. And again, apparently nobody saw this except Elisha and Gehazi. Now, what's the significance of the 7 sneezes? We know that 7 occurs all over the place in the Bible. In the book of Revelation, this is all over the place, and it's organized. It looks like it's 7 cycles. And 7 is considered the number of completeness. And it's a combination of 4 for the earth and 3 for the Trinity, and where God comes in contact with his earth, there you have perfection, there you have fullness. The only other time that I can recall in the Old Testament that 7 times is used is in Naaman's washing, which we're going to get next week, when Elisha tells him, go to the River Jordan and wash yourself, dip yourself in the muddy Jordan River 7 times. Okay. And he does, and he's healed. But have any of you got a guess as to what's the significance of that? Maybe there is no significance. Maybe it's just giving us a eyewitness account to say, this is not a fable. This is not just a myth. Whoever is reporting this gave us these details so that you know that this actually happened. This was a historical event. And I'm comfortable with that, okay? That we get this kind of detail, all these details, because it's just not a fabrication. Now, granted, I understand that critics of the Bible who say that these are just made up stories would say, well, a literary guy creating a story can add this kind of detail too. So that's no rock solid proof that this is a historical event, but I'm content to say, no, this happened. And I think these details support it, okay? Now let me stop there and see if you have any questions.
In this paragraph, Elijah is referred to often as the man of God rather than my name.
Right.
Is there a cultural reason why that was done? You
know, I don't know why the writer of this text does that, unless this story came from Elisha. And you remember that John in his gospel talks about the disciple whom Jesus loved, but he never calls himself by name. And so it may be a form of humility as he passes the story on to others. And the person who recorded these for us in 2 Kings is preserving that humility in telling the story. That's one possibility. Jim, have you heard any other guesses? And so that's, my best guess, okay? There's certain humility. What is interesting is how much does Elisha, the understudy, copy from Elijah, his predecessor. Both of them pray before the dead boy is brought back to life. Both stretch themselves more than one time on the dead child. In Elisha's case, he only does it twice and life comes back. In Elijah's case, he does it 3 times and then life comes into him. So why does God put life in this boy after only 2 stretchings? In Elisha's case, but it took 3. Maybe they don't care. Maybe God, who is sovereign, says, I can do anything I want. I could have done it after 1 stretching. I could have had 5 stretchings. This is how it happened, okay? And so that's what he reports to us. Any questions about that? Any thoughts? Okay, verse 36. Then he summoned Gehazi and said, call this Shunammite. And the word Shunammite is in the feminine form, so it means the Shunammite woman. So he called her. Where's the husband in all this? He's a non-factor. He's nowhere in the story. And when she came to him, he said, pick up your son. Now we're getting some director's help here from the text. If you're going to cast this boy as a child, here he says she's going to pick him up just as she walked upstairs and put him on the bed. Now she's going to pick him up and take him down the stairs. Okay. So maybe that supports the picture that some of you had of a boy 8, 9, 10 or so, not an 18-year-old. Okay. So in this case, he talks directly to her. Pick your son up. So maybe all of this guessing about why does he talk through Gehazi? Why does he talk directly to her? Maybe that's just not an important issue. And the point is sometimes he worked through his spokesman and sometimes he relates to her directly. And he has that freedom as a man of God to do what God wants him to do. And in this case, he felt, I'm going to talk to her directly. So she came and fell at his feet, bowing to the ground. Then she picked up her son and went out. Well, we've talked about that. Any questions about this episode? Now we only got 5 minutes for the rest of the story. I mean, yeah. Now let's say it takes 2 days for her to get to Carmel and get back, and then they have the miracle rising from the dead. So what's the husband doing all this time? Isn't he curious? Hey, where's my kid? What happened to him? Doesn't even go up. Does he go up in Elijah's room and look around? All these unanswered questions that, I've got a list of 187 questions I'm going to ask different people the day after Judgment Day, if I can find them, for Paul, for Jesus, and for all these people. And this would be one I would have for Elijah, the woman. I believe she's a believer, and we'll see her. If I can find her in the crowd, I'm going to ask her, tell me about your husband. Maybe she won't want to talk about her husband there. If heaven's a place of happiness, let's leave that in the past, okay? Now, I'm assuming something negative, and I apologize for that, because I'm trying to make a soap opera out of something maybe that isn't a soap opera, okay? Maybe this is just a cultural thing that men didn't get involved as much in their kids' lives. And I had grandparents who never hugged us. And now we live in a hugging culture, okay? And they didn't love us any less. And my dad never hugged me, as I can recall. Matter of fact, my mother had to tell us after my dad died, boys, my twin brother and I, will you come in each night, give me a hug and a kiss, because I'm really lonely without your dad. So it was not our habit until we made it our habit with her invitation. And so she taught us something powerful by that. If you need something, ask for it. And that really stuck. So now we flash ahead to 2 Kings 8, and the woman comes back into the picture. We got a bunch of other stories that I'm going to skip over. Now Elisha had said to the woman whose son he had restored to life, arise and depart with your household and sojourn wherever you can. Get out of here, for the Lord has called for a famine, and it will come upon the land for 7 years. So she's going to have to leave home for 7 years. What if she's a wealthy woman? What's going to happen to her property? What's going to happen to her land? And where's her husband in the whole story? So the woman arose and did according to the word of the man of God. She went with her household and sojourned in the land of the Philistines 7 years. Now here's a map that shows where Shunem is, and Philistia is way down here. So this is a non-Jewish territory. And she goes outside of Israel. Now, other followers of God have done the same thing. David goes to Philistia for security when Saul's trying to kill him, and Isaac goes to Philistia. So there are examples in the scriptures. But after the 7 years are over, she's going to come back and make it a plea to the king of Samaria, the king of Israel. At the end of the 7 years, when the woman returned from the land of the Philistines, she went to appeal to the king for her house and her land. Now the king was talking with Gehazi, the servant of the man of God, saying, "Tell me all the great things that Elisha has done." And while he was telling the king how Elisha had restored the dead to life, behold, the woman whose son he had restored to life appealed to the king for her house and her land. And Gehazi said, "My lord, O king, here is the woman, and here is her son whom Elisha restored to life." And when the king asked the woman, she told him. So the king appointed an official for her, saying, "Restore all that was hers, together with all the produce of the fields, from the day that she left the land until now." So that's 7 years worth of income, okay? Now this usually happened on the 50th year, it's the year of Jubilee, when people who had to sell their land or had lost their land through poverty were given the land back. Because God said, all this land belongs to me, it doesn't belong to you guys. You've only got it on lease, okay? And if for some reason you have to sell your property in order to pay your bills, on the 50th year, you get it all back, because that's just the way I'm going to operate. And we don't know if this was a 50th year or if this was just an exception. But at any rate, the king says, "We will take care of this woman. She's special." And he does. And she gets her property back. Okay, I've got 1 minute left. Watch this. We know where Shunem was, right? It was right here on the hill of Moreh. And it's where Elisha raised her, the Shunammite widow's son. What else happened here? On the same hill, Mount Moreh, is the little town of Nain, right around the corner. Shunem is on the south side of Moreh, and Nain is on the north side of Moreh. Do you think that the people of Nain, after Jesus raises this widow's son, are going to remember their history? Are they going to remember the story of Elisha? Are they going to say, "Whoa, this is the same place where Elisha raised a widow's son or a woman's son to life"? And the people seem to make that connection in Luke chapter 7. They say, "Surely a great prophet has risen among us. God has visited his people." And I'm going to conclude with that thought. Ancient people had much better memories than you and I do. They didn't have cell phones, and they therefore couldn't look up the birth dates of their grandchildren on their phone. They all had it all up here, okay? But they also had their stories up here. And so I believe that the people of Nain knew the history of the stuff that happened on their mountain, and they would have made the connection like that. Oral tradition, the power of oral tradition. So any concluding questions or thoughts? Then let's conclude with prayer. Lord God, our Heavenly Father, thank you for showing us how powerfully you work through your prophets and how powerfully you operate in our lives too. Thank you for reminding us that you are a God of life, not death, that you are a God who brings hope. And we ask that you would continue to work in our lives too, to see how many blessings you've already given us, but also to keep opening ourselves to all the other blessings you want to give us so that we can share them with others. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.